The goals for today are to be able to explain the nitrogen cycle. We've covered the nitrogen cycle on the surface level. We're going to dig into it today. So you will need to be able to explain some of the more in-depth parts of this. Okay. Then you'll need to be able to define what nitrogen fixation is. Again, this is a concept we covered briefly in a previous chapter, and today we're going to really talk about what nitrogen fixation looks like and what it does. And then you'll also need to be able to tell me where plants and animals get their phosphorus for. We're going to cover the fact that phosphorus is an important element today. You should be on the lookout for where it comes from. All right. Nitrogen. Nitrogen is a critical part of protein production. Without nitrogen, it is not possible for plants or animals to make proteins. And as you know from our learning about proteins, proteins are the basic building blocks from which we build our body structures. So if we didn't have proteins, it would be a pretty big deal. Nitrogen gas, fortunately, is a very abundant resource. About 78% of the air is made of nitrogen. In fact, every time you take a breath, it's roughly 78% nitrogen that you're breathing in. And using the right tools, it's relatively easy to separate nitrogen gas out of the air. It's not super reactive, so it doesn't react with the other elements in the air, so it's very easy to separate out. But there is a problem. The issue that we have is that nitrogen gas cannot be used to make proteins. So nitrogen gas is formed in what we call diatomic molecules. That means that in nitrogen gas, the the atoms of nitrogen are bonded to each other like this. You have one nitrogen molecule, or one nitrogen atom and another nitrogen atom bonded together to make a molecule of nitrogen gas. And this that I've shown you with the 3 lines there connecting the 2 nitrogen atoms means that this is a triple bond between nitrogen atoms. Their sharing of 3 pairs of electrons, their forming of that triple bond, makes this a very stable atom. It's stable and it's strong. So it's not easy to break this bond, and because it's not easy to break this bond, the atom doesn't really want to react with anything else, these 2 atoms that are tied up in this molecule. As a result, nitrogen gas just really doesn't easily react with a lot of materials, and so it's very difficult to get nitrogen gas into a form that plants and animals can use. In order to be used, those nitrogen molecules have to be made into compounds, and that is what we call nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation is the process of taking nitrogen gas and causing it to react with something so that you can get nitrogen compounds that can then be used. Nitrogen fixation occurs naturally in our world, and it occurs through a couple of processes. There are bacteria that live on the roots of plants that do nitrogen fixation, and then when lightning strikes, some of the reactions caused by a lightning strike, because it produces a ton of energy, right? Some of the reactions driven by that lightning strike then cause nitrogen fixation to also happen. We've covered that before. We talked about that when we did the surface level talk about the nitrogen cycle in a previous chapter. So let's actually talk about what happens during nitrogen fixation. During nitrogen fixation, bacteria, or lightning, change gaseous nitrogen, so that gas form of nitrogen, into something called ammonia. Ammonia is one nitrogen atom that has 3 hydrogen atoms bonded to it. Then, the addition of a hydrogen ion to this molecule results in a charged ion called an ammonium ion. So a hydrogen ion would be a hydrogen atom that has lost its electron. So it's essentially just a proton and maybe a neutron in the nucleus. Okay, so it has a positive charge, and when it gets added to the ammonia molecule, then it brings the total charge of that ammonia molecule up to being positive, and as a result, we call it an ammonium ion because now it's charged. Some of the ammonium ions are then changed into nitrate ions. Nitrate is a nitrogen atom bonded with 3 oxygen atoms, and it has a total negative charge of 1. So that's why you'll see that little negative symbol on there. Both ammonium ions and nitrate ions are forms of nitrogen that plants are able to utilize. Okay, they're able to take them into the plant and use them for protein production. Once nitrogen is in a usable form, plants absorb it and they make proteins that are necessary for life. So if you remember when we learned about the macromolecules and we talked about proteins, we said proteins are built from amino acids. Well, there are several amino acids that require nitrogen to be formed. And if you remember, our bodies need all of the different amino acids. We make some of them, but some of them we have to get from our food. So some of the amino acids produced by plants are those essential amino acids that we need for protein production. So nitrogen is really quite critical to our everyday lives, whether we realize it or not. Animals then eat plants. We get those proteins that contain those amino acids, and then we can use those to build our own proteins to help our body function and run correctly. Due to a rise in demand for agriculture, bacteria and lightning actually can't keep up with the demand for nitrogen. So as populations on Earth increased, and there started to be a demand for more food products that can only be produced through large agricultural systems, we found out that we can't produce enough nitrogen naturally just by planting the right crops and those things. So, in the 1900s, a man named Fritz Haber developed a method for making ammonia directly from nitrogen and hydrogen gases. So ammonia, if you remember, was that first step of the nitrogen fixation process. If you can get ammonia, then that ammonia will react to form ammonium ions and nitrate ions. So you have to have that ammonia first. And he found a way to use this process to produce nitrogen or ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen gas. Okay. Then they can take that ammonia and use it as a fertilizer on any soil that's nitrogen deficient. So if you've ever seen fields or helped with fields getting sprayed with ammonia, okay, or not necessarily sprayed, you don't want to breathe ammonia, so they usually disc it into the ground. Okay, then this is the process that was happening. They were helping take fields that didn't have enough nitrogen in them to support plant growth and put some usable forms of nitrogen into that soil so that they could then be used. With this increase in ammonia, there's better outcomes for agricultural groups, and then higher productions of food were produced, so it is good for everyone overall, and they named that process the Haber method in honor of the scientist who developed it. All right. Done talking about nitrogen, let's talk a little bit about phosphorus then. Like nitrogen, phosphorus is an element that you can see on the periodic table, and it's an element that's necessary for life. Your bones and your teeth cannot form correctly without phosphorus. Your DNA, so the very instructions for your existence, contain phosphorus molecules. Okay, so if you're going to be reproducing cells that are going to need to make copies of DNA, they're going to need phosphorus to do it. And the processes inside your cells that transfer energy around the cell to different places where it's needed require phosphorus to function. So as you can see, a very critical piece of the puzzle of life. Can't do life without it. Phosphorus is not typically found like as a gas like nitrogen is. Okay? Instead, you'll find phosphorus in rocks, usually in the form of a compound called calcium phosphate, which contains calcium and phosphorus and oxygen. When rocks get broken down by weathering, okay, different types of weathering over time, that phosphorus is released. Usually the compound that it's released in is a phosphate ion, so phosphorus and oxygen, but a negatively charged ion. And then when that is released from the rock, it's left in the soil, which is where plants get it. So rain falls, gets the soil wet, phosphate ions dissolve into the water, the plant uptakes the water through their roots, and they're able to get phosphorus that way. Most often, phosphorus is very plentiful in soil, but sometimes, if people don't take care of their soil, a lot of erosion happens, and when erosion happens, we're removing weathered rock and soil and things from an area and washing them away to somewhere else, and as a result, then you can be left with soil that doesn't have enough phosphate in it. So if that is an issue in an area, then they can supplement how much phosphorus is needed by using phosphorus-containing fertilizers on that area.